Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the International African American Museum Center for Family History monthly webinar series. I am Shelley Murphy. I am the coordinator of education, and I'm thrilled to be your host today. We're honored to have a very special guest joining us. That's Dr. Joshua Rothman, historian and author of The Ledger and the Chain, How the Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America. Dr. Rothman's groundbreaking work offers a powerful exploration of the often hidden history of domestic slave traders and their profound influence on the development of America. Today's discussion promised to be thought-provoking as we dive into the complexities of this subject and the lasting impact on American history and society. After the discussion, we'll have a Q&A session. So please feel free to place your questions in the chat box at any time during the talk, and we'll get to as many as we can. I also want to note that we have Darius Brown at the Center for Family History live at the museum as well, and he's here co-hosting. So thank you all for being here, and without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Joshua Rothman. Hello, Josh.
Hello, Shelley. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Good.
I'm doing just great, and so thankful that you're with us today, and appreciate taking out a Saturday time to hang out with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Great. We've got a lot of folks from all over the United States, and even greetings from Accra in Ghana that are tuning in today. And again, we can, we'll get to the Q&A questions. So for the audience, just so you know, I just have a set of questions that I'll be asking him. This is kind of informal. We're just having a discussion. No typical presentation or anything. And so we're kind of aware of where everybody is coming from. A lot of family historians, a lot of genealogists, authors, and other scholars throughout the country that'll be tuning in. So again, I'm going to start off with the typical question. It's just for Josh, just what inspired you to write this book? Was there something particular moment or a discovery that motivated you to explore this history of the domestic slave trade in America?
Well, yes and no. I wasn't looking to do this book in particular when I started thinking about what I wanted to write about. I had finished my previous book, which was about the expansion of slavery to frontier Mississippi, in particular, the expansion of the Cotton South. And after that, I was thinking about biography, actually, sort of as a form. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who I wanted to write a biography about. I knew I didn't want to do presidents, generals, your sort of Father's Day Barnes and Noble list of characters. And I don't know, but so no, I wasn't thinking about this book in particular, but I do remember very vividly sort of one day in my office, just kind of flipping through books on my shelf. And, the previous book, obviously, the slave trade is an important part of that. That's how a lot of enslaved people end up in frontier Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And there had been a lot of work in the last 20 years or so about the domestic slave trade. And I don't know, it really just sort of occurred to me one day that we knew a lot about the slave trade, but very little about slave traders. Who were the people who actually operated this business? Where did they come from? Why did they choose to do the things that they did? What were sort of the arcs of their lives before, during, and after the trade? And, you really can't read about the domestic slave trade without coming across the name Franklin and Armfield, right, as a company. But the more I sort of poked around, there was I guess you could call it a biography of Isaac Franklin written in the 1930s. There were sort of two kind of biographical articles in a state historical journal written about John Armfield in the 1940s. And everything that came after that was based on going back to that material. So it'd been, 75 years since anyone had bothered sort of thinking about who these people were. So, originally I had thought I was going to settle. I had settled on doing a biography of Isaac Franklin. He's sort of the main player in this story. And I thought, okay, it's going to be if you're writing a one-person biography, that's the person to pick. But the more I sort of poked around in it, the more I realized you couldn't really extract Isaac Franklin. You couldn't pull that thread without dealing with John Armfield. And then very quickly it became clear you also had to deal with Rice Ballard, who was their third partner in the business. So the book, yes, there sort of was a moment where it occurred to me, hey, this is probably a good idea for a book, but it really was an accumulation of things that led me to what kind of became partially a group biography of these particular traders. And partially, really, it's a biography of the slave trade itself. Sure. That was among the many subtitles we played around with for the book. A biography of the domestic slave trade was one of them, because that's really how the book kind of evolved. It's not just the story of these men; it's really the arc of the trade itself from the era of the American Revolution until the end of the Civil War.
So while you're doing this, and I do slave era research, and a lot of the folks in the audience, either for a project or for their own ancestors, the information that you were discovering, as I go through my work, I have emotional moments. Mm-hmm. And when you're finding out some of this information about these three individuals and this whole system of the trade and everything, were there times that you just had to walk away? Reading your book, and I had to put it down a few times and pick it back up. Mm-hmm. And I'm unfortunately one of those that can have the audio and the hardcover as well. And sometimes hearing that audio was totally different also than me reading. And there was times it was emotional. Did you have anything like that? And I'm identifying you as the author. And were there moments like that at any time, or was it more just, I got to do the focus and stay on the research and not get emotionally tied in type thing?
No, I had a lot of moments like that. Okay. It was a difficult book to research, and it was actually harder to write than it was to research. Because you're right. I mean, when you're doing research on something, there is a way in which you're just sort of sitting there in the archive and it's page after page after page, particularly when I was in New Orleans and cataloging their slave sales, just going through the notarial records, page after page after page. You're just entering data. That's all it is. Right. Which is disturbing in its own right. But yeah, I mean, every once in a while you come across something and you're just caught up short. And yeah, I would have to just sort of walk away. There's plenty of moments in there that kind of, I think, would move just about any person with a heart to tears. And I don't say that as, sort of, kind of poor me, right? I made the choice to do this, and I think it was an important book to do, but I definitely had moments where I was like, man, I can't wait to be done with this project. I can tell you the day that I wrote the end of the conclusion, I basically burst into tears because I was like, finally, this is a huge step toward getting these people out of my life once and for all. I mean, they never really leave when you're the author of a book, but yeah, no, it was difficult. But I think anytime you're really delving into the history of slavery, you're going to have moments like that. Anything that you think, I've been thinking and writing and working in the archives of slavery for 30 years. And, every time you think you've seen everything, and I've seen a lot, every time you think that there's nothing left that could possibly shock you. Nothing really surprises me anymore.
Right. Right.
But I definitely still have moments from just like, you just sort of shake your head and there's part of you that just, you can't believe what you're reading.
And that's a lot what we experience as genealogists. Is just
Mm-hmm.
like, are they serious? Did this really happen?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in chapter 4, you noted about the girl that was picked up in Charlottesville. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm only relating that because I'm affiliated there, you know, and just watching what she went through. And again, I also wondered on the experiences because you were able to include names. So from us as genealogists, we appreciate that aspect. And also you mentioned the notarial records. So again, with the audience, I want to make sure that we share some of the things, places that you looked at. But were there any significant challenges faced when researching? Because this is what happens at the crossroads for most of us. It's like, where are these records?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the New Orleans records and things. But again, were there any significant challenges that you faced while writing the book?
You mean in terms of the writing or the research?
The research.
Yeah. I mean, I think not so much challenges as frustration, right?
Okay.
You get into these records, and when you've worked in them enough, you kind of know what's possible and what's not, right? You know what you might find and what you're not likely to find. So, on the one hand, the state of Louisiana, if you're trying to track slave sales, is sort of a gold mine, right? Because they have a very specific and almost unique record keeping system, unique within the United States, at least, right? They worked on a civil law system, and what that meant was that, among other things, it meant was that enslaved people were categorized as property in the same way that, say, real estate was.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true in most of the United States. So if you look in Virginia records, for example, there are no systematic records kept of slave sales. If you look in deed books, which is sort of the kind of an analogous record to notarial books, not exactly, but close enough. Deed books keep track of property sales, right? You can find separate records of taxes, estate sales, things like that. So what you're going to be able to find in New Orleans are people's names, sure. Individual people, and you can sort of follow them along the journey by which they were trafficked. Not all of them, and not at every step of the way, but you can find a lot of information. Okay. But it's frustrating when you get to places like, you have all these ship manifests with people's names on them that they're shipped out of Virginia. But if they end up in a place like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, the odds of your being able to figure out where they actually ended up, it's really luck of the draw. It's almost impossible. And that's very frustrating.
Very, very, and very. And I know some of the folks that is in the audience, and they're going to agree with you. Some folks are able to track, but again, the difficulty is unbelievable also, and very frustrating. So coming back to the individuals, can you share insights on the personal lives or motivations of any key figures or someone that you're remembering from the book that was discussed in the book? Anything that comes up, was there any background or anything else that you found, that maybe changed the writing or what you said based on what you learned about somebody or something, or, and just saying, if and again, I will make the statement that lots of violence, lots of raping, lots of beatings, lots of everything. But is there any one story that just hung with you that still you think about sometimes?
I mean,
just too many.
Yeah, no, there are a lot. I mean, I think if I had to pick sort of one kind of story that really that sticks with me, at least from the book, I think is one that actually sticks with a lot of people when they read the book, and it's the story of a woman named Virginia Boyd. And it's a horrifying story. So Virginia Boyd is a woman who is enslaved by Rice Ballard's business partner. So after Rice Ballard gets out of the slave trade with Franklin and Armfield, he basically starts another business with a man named Samuel Boyd, who's a lawyer in Natchez. And they buy plantations. That's their business. They buy and run a series of plantations. And Sam Boyd enslaved Virginia Boyd. He basically rapes her over the series of many, many years. They have multiple children together. And it's not clear exactly what happened, but one day he just decides he's done. He's going to get rid of her. So he sends her and her children to Ballard. And he says, look, I don't care what you do with her, but you can't come back here. And then eventually he says he wants her sold. He wants to disappear her effectively.
And the children?
And the children, yes. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they're sold together, apart, he doesn't care. Virginia Boyd gets wind of this. She knows it's coming. And she tries to keep herself from being sold, particularly away from her children. Ballard sells her anyway. He passes her off to a former colleague of his, who he's sort of invested in this man's slave trade business. And he says, look, just take her away and get rid of her. And somehow she ends up in Texas, in Houston. Somehow she manages to get a letter back to Rice Ballard from Texas. And this letter, she tries every possible strategy that she can in a single letter to try to get Ballard to bring her back to Mississippi. She begs him. She tries to chastise him. She tries to shame him. She tries to say, look, man, I know you have children. I know you understand. She promises, she's like, I don't know what I did, but I promise I'm sorry. I will never do it again. I will never speak a word of my relationship to Sam Boyd. I mean, everything in a single letter, because it's like, you don't know what'll work.
Right.
And, if Ballard responds, I can't imagine that he did. We have no record of it. I'm not the only historian to publish that story or to try to figure out what happened to her. We have no idea what happened to her. Can't find her the earliest we might be able to find her is in the 1870 census. Can't find her. And it's just, it's an amazing letter because it's so rare to kind of see something like that. And it's really the kind of story that it sticks with you. I mean, it just takes everything about slavery and the domestic slave trade in some ways and sort of packs it into a single incident, a single person, a single letter, and you just see all of it in one place. And it's it's haunting. It really is.
And he knew those children were his.
Sam Boyd did. Oh yeah, no. And she writes in the letter, she's like, I can't believe a human being would do this. How could a man sell his own children? That's what I mean about trying to shame him, right? But these were not men who cared about those things.
Correct. So with reference to that incident and others, how really, and I'm saying this kind of broadly, did the domestic slave trade shape the economic development of America? We know money is flowing left and right, up and down. So especially in the southern states, how does this really connect? Is it just the money that's coming out of this, or is there more that's shaping the economic development of those southern states in America?
So the short answer is that if there's no slave trade, slavery can't function. Mm-hmm. If it was impossible or illegal to buy and sell enslaved people, slavery can't grow. It requires that movement of people. It requires the ability to use enslaved people not only for their labor, but for debts, for mortgages, for borrowing money, for kind of having a sort of flexibility with your assets, because that's what enslaved people were. So it's not just profit and loss. It's about having the system be able to function and to grow over time. And that's really, I mean, within the South itself, that's kind of the critical role that slave traders play, right? They're in the simplest terms, they're middlemen, right? They move people from one place to another and they make their money off the profit. But it's not just about moving laborers from place to place. They're critical cogs in making the entire financial system work, because enslaved people are money.
Yes. So, and I'm going to ask this question. Is this what white people fear? Is what you just explained, but also your research, your book, the information that's there? And I'm thinking of now
Today,
knowing that this system went on because, my opinion, they couldn't justify their actions. And like you said earlier, they just didn't care. So
I don't
know if this is fear. I think it is fear for today. They don't want this kind of stuff to come out, but we're finding it. The records are there.
So I actually, look, the book came out, shockingly to my way of thinking, it's 3 years ago already. Right. So I've talked to a lot of audiences. I've talked to people of just about every kind of racial and ethnic background that you could imagine. And my sense of sort of white people in audiences, it's really very mixed. It's kind of all over the place. Look, the people who want to hear me talk about this are sort of a self-selecting group, right? The white people who want to hear and read about this are not people who are afraid of this. In fact, quite the opposite. They're people who want to hear more, right? Mm-hmm. Who feel like this is a story that, for whatever reason, whether it was where they were brought up, whether it was where they went to school, whether it was just, choices of what kind of information they personally wanted to take in, for whatever reason, they've gotten to a point in their life, they said, I never knew this. And I feel like this is an important part of who we are as a country, who we are as a people. For some people, who they are as individuals, maybe they're from people who are from slaveholding families in their ancestry. So I actually think there are a lot of white people who aren't afraid of this at all. Now, that's not to say that there is not the other side of this, which we know all too well, of people who, I guess being afraid of it is sort of one way to look at it, but it's more just they would just prefer not to talk about it. And I think there are a lot of reasons why people feel that way. None of them, I think, very flattering. But if you want to frame it in terms of fear, I think that's certainly one way to put it. But then the obvious question becomes, okay, well, what are you afraid of exactly? And I think that's different for different people. For some people, it's just sort of discomfort. It makes them feel gross, which it should. For some people, it's they're afraid of how it might shape the way that their children understand the country that they live in. For some people, they're afraid that it's some part of some sort of larger agenda. Maybe it's a push for reparations. Some people fear that it's part of a larger, just broadly sort of left-wing attack on the United States. So I think there's lots of ways in which this history feels very uncomfortable and potentially dangerous for people. But I would not want to throw all white Americans in that basket, because my experience with that is that it's much more, it's a much wider range of a much wider sort of set of perceptions of how it comes across.
And I also want to include some of us African Americans have that same feeling on both sides. Because I can remember a time as a young girl, you just didn't talk about that stuff. And so I could label that fear, or take your term of just being uncomfortable about it, or they didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, and I do think that's true of Black audiences that I've talked to as well. And it's entirely understandable. Honestly, this is really difficult, painful, for some people, literally traumatic history. And to decide that you willingly want to go get more of it. And in some ways, the book is about some elements of it that are kind of the worst, like the darkest parts of it. Like if that's not a place you want to go, I totally understand that. I really, really do.
Sure. And you mentioned a little bit about slave trader networks. And can you elaborate on the networks and relationships that slave traders built to sustain their business? And how did these networks operate across these state lines?
Sure. So slave traders need a lot of different kinds of people and sort of sectors of the economy and services in order to make their business work, right? They need, for Franklin and Armfield, for example, they're often sending people by ship, right? So they need people who build boats, they need people who crew boats, they need ship captains, they need people who supply them while they're keeping people from one place or to the next place, which means they need blacksmiths and carpenters and hostlers and food purveyors, and sometimes they need midwives. And it just goes on and on and on. Smaller slave traders are keeping people in taverns, so they need tavern keepers. They need newspaper editors who are willing to advertise their business. They need agents of the state, right? I mean, the slave trade is the thing about the slave trade is it's human trafficking, and so that's how we kind of think of it now. But the difference is that human trafficking now is not legal, right? Slave trading is perfectly legal, which means you need an apparatus of the state to sustain it. So you need sheriffs and jailers and judges and on and on and on. And so you can't just sort of pull the slave trade out and say, okay, well, the United States is kind of, the economy is what it is, but you can just sort of pull the slave trade out and put it to the side. You can't, because it's all sort of connected. And that doesn't even begin to get into the financial system, where you need bankers, right? Slave traders have lawyers. They get into lawsuits all the time. They need doctors. Almost any kind of sort of service industry, any kind of financial instrument, any kind of political engagement, any kind of law enforcement is going to be connected to the slave trade in some way or another, because it's a business.
And it's really hard that everybody's basically in the business and it's legal, and thinking that nobody thought about this is wrong. I'm sure there were some folks, but nothing pretty much stopped it. And I mentioned a little bit, how did the slave traders, specifically these three, if they ever had to justify morally or legally their actions, what do you think they would do? Or if they ever had, was it just because the law said it was okay, we could do this, and we have all these other connections that agree that it's okay? I mean, was there any sorriness or, that they were in the slave trade? And I think about Virginia Boyd, when he knew that was his woman, and they had several kids, and he just literally walked away.
Yeah.
And we could almost relate to that today sometimes in certain situations. And so this is a hard one for me. And I'm thinking, okay, and I don't want to bring religion in here, but there's even a whole nother side of something not tapping in to these three men.
So I get that question a lot, and I find that I have a very the short answer to the question is you're going to be very disappointed.
Yeah.
I mean, well, maybe you won't be disappointed, maybe you won't be, but maybe you'll be surprised. Um, which is that if these men, I think this is true of most slave traders, the vast majority, if they ever expressed any remorse for anything they did, ever felt guilty about anything they did, ever wondered, maybe I shouldn't be doing this anymore, if they ever felt that way, they kept it to themselves. I've not seen anything in the records that you could even read into that says, oh, maybe there's a glimmer of guilt here, of sort of moral responsibility. They just, no, it's not there. And, you know, I think there are lots of ways to kind of think about that. One is probably the one way to think about it is that these are men who are in what in modern terms we would simply call them sociopaths, right? Mm-hmm. They feel no empathy. They feel no sense of guilt. They simply do what they do, and they're kind of indifferent to other people's feelings. Mm-hmm. Another way to think about it is to say, well, I mean, it's impossible not to see what's in front of them, right? And they perpetuate massive amounts of violence, and seem to take some pleasure in doing so. That maybe somewhere in their psyche, they're just sort of burying this so deep that it just doesn't occur to them. But I think what I find interesting about the question is that, and I don't know if this is where you're coming from with this question, but I think sometimes when people ask that question, they're hoping that somewhere in there's sort of a glimmer of humanity in these people.
I was hoping, but I know it's not there.
Yeah, and I didn't find it in your book. I mean, let me ask you. I know this is where I get the questions, but I'm curious. Like why do you hope that?
He's human. He's a man. He's a father.
Yeah.
And it could be the neighbor. Oh, that could be the fourth great grandfather.
Yeah.
You know, and do I have that gene of just not caring?
Yeah, no, I think that's another part of it is that people wonder, like, and look, and I think that many of us, if we ask ourselves on, you know, I've taught students for a long time, right? And had talked to many audiences for a long time. And I know everyone likes to think that if they were alive in the 19th century, they would have been the abolitionists, right? But you know what? You probably wouldn't have been. Right. And I know you probably wouldn't have been because most people weren't. Yeah. And that, I think, is actually, that's the kind of moral question that I think is important for us to actually ask ourselves, which is not to kind of imagine ourselves and sort of take our current morals and be like, well, if we lived 150 years ago, we would have those same morals and this is what we would do. It's much harder to kind of recognize that you probably wouldn't actually. And so
I'd like to say I would dream of being the Quaker standing.
Sure. And some of us would have been, of course, but like the odds are against you there. And it's, so looking back at men like this, I mean, look, I don't want to say that most Americans are like these men because they were not, right? It's a very,
but Josh, they allowed this to keep going.
Correct. Right. And that's the thing, right? It's a very small number of people who are willing to wake up every single day for years and carry out the business of the slave trade. There are always going to be people like that because there are terrible people in the world. There are now, there were then, there always will be. The question is, all the people around them who just sort of, even if they had kind of mixed feelings about it or thought it was gross and should be abolished, you know, they still might have dinner with them.
Sure.
Right. And that to me is a much, much harder question to kind of get at. Like, what does that say about us as a species, as a country, any way you want to frame it? You know, in some ways trying to figure out, slave traders themselves, what are they doing and why? In some ways, that's actually the easiest question to answer. The bigger ones are much, much harder.
Okay. Next one. Do you think the role of domestic slave traders has been relatively understudied or underrepresented in American history?
That depends what you mean by American history. If you mean among kind of professional historians, I think that's a lot less true than it used to be. And that's not just because of my book, right? I mean, lots of historians have written about this now and continue to write about it and do really, really excellent work. So I think we know a lot more about the slave trade and slave traders and people who were trafficked by slave traders. We know a lot more about this whole constellation of things than we used to. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say to what extent all of it has really sunk into the larger public imagination. I still come across a lot of people who I know this is going to sound crazy, but they never knew a domestic slave trade existed.
The way we can see it framed now and seeing the
right.
results.
I think so many, I think the vast majority of people in the United States, when they hear slave trade, they think Africa. They think the transatlantic trade. Pretty much everybody knows about that now. And it doesn't take much to get the light bulb to go off in people's heads, right? Because when I would say I was working on the slave trade, they would ask about Africa, and I'd be like, no, that's not what I'm writing about. And you get a sort of quizzical look on their face, but then you can see sort of the light bulb go on and be like, oh, right, of course that was a thing. But they didn't know. They never thought about it. It never occurred to them. It's not that they can't believe it existed. It's just that they literally didn't know because they never thought about it before. And so I think that's probably less true than it used to be, but it's still more true than it should be. I would say that.
And we're starting to see the databases like kinfolkology, oceans of kinfolk, and the slave voyages where you got the ship manifest and things. And now researchers or family historians can go in and actually try to track and see if they could find their ancestor based on certain information they might have come across. So I agree with you there. It's coming more prevalent now because of books like yours and things like that. But there's still more to learn.
Oh, for sure.
I don't know how much all of us have really tapped in. You were focused on these three, but weren't there others?
Hundreds.
Yes. And again, you tapped in probably on the three largest known, going through, but could there even be the little small traders that were not in the magnitude of Armfield and Ballard and Franklin? What about within the local communities? There's buying and selling going on. It might not be from the dock, the riverbanks or, like Gadsden's Wharf in South Carolina, which is actually where the museum is built over that wharf. And they have there that up to a little over 40% of all the Africans that came through that wharf, Gadsden's Wharf. So that's a sacred spot, and that's for all of the United States per se. And then once people got in, of course, you got the trade still going on, buying and selling. But what about just the I'm going to say the average county, and from slaveholder to slaveholder? Those operations were also going on. And I think of UVA, I'm researching those that were rented to UVA, not bought and sold, but rented, a whole nother system to look at. So were there times that you come across, because the influence you laid out, that Armfield and them had to have connections with local people, lawyers, contractors, whatever it might be. So were there little sales going on besides just the big ones that we're seeing coming into New Orleans? Were there buying and selling all the way down from Virginia to New Orleans?
Everywhere.
And to the little person.
Everywhere.
Okay.
If there was, I mean, to put it as kind of plainly as possible, if there was slavery in a place, there's a slave trade in a place.
Okay.
It's true.
Yeah.
You know, every plant, you know, there is a way in which there's a kind of way of thinking about this, which is to say that, you know, look, every slaveholder is a slave trader.
Jeez.
There are very few slaveholders of any significant size who don't at some point buy or sell somebody. So, and particularly if you're selling somebody, you know, what's the difference between you and a slave trader? Now, I think there are ways of articulating that difference, right? There's a difference between, you know, between sort of buying and selling something, you know, here and there, and doing it professionally, right, for a living. The whole point of what you do is buying and selling people. But, you know, in terms of kind of effectively, when slaveholders buy and sell people, they're engaging in the same kind of processes that slave traders did. So, you know, look, if it's a place that was a town before the Civil War, right, and and it's in a slave state, people are going to be bought and sold on the steps of the courthouse. People are going to be bought and sold pretty much at every, you know, tavern and bar. People are bought and sold at hotels. People are bought and sold, you know, by slave traders who had kind of storefronts at a certain point. You know, I think that we commemorate certain places, right? Gadsden Wharf is one place. You know, the Freedom House Museum in Alexandria is another place. I remember in Fredericksburg, there was a sort of a block that was known as sort of the auction block.
Yeah, something's happening with that.
They sort of preserved. Right, I know they've sort of moved it around a bunch.
With that block.
You know, and look, and I get that there are reasons why because we can't get our heads around it being every place. But, you know, and I say that just to say that I know that some places are particularly commemorated as being sacred, and understandably so. But if you think that every place where a person is bought and sold is a sacred place, there are sacred places all around you. You may live in one. You may walk down the street of one every single day and not even think twice about it. And that's very difficult to sort of live with, right? How do you do that on a day-to-day basis? And that's why we single out particular places. But I think it gives in some ways a false impression that, like, okay, the slave trade was here, but not here. But that's simply not true.
And then you've got like the memorial to enslaved laborers. Mary has one, UVA has one. And I think of the little stone block in Charlottesville. I walked over it.
Sure, we all have.
I stepped and I turned around and looked back. And it was like, oh, wait, you know, and wanted to check the surroundings. And I think a lot of us have that. But we need to go see that, you know, and from my perspective. So how do you believe the legacy of the domestic slave traders should be remembered and taught in American history today, if it can be taught today somewhat, you know?
Oh, it certainly can be taught. You know, most things can be taught.
Go there, totally.
You know, how do I think we are? I mean, you know, I know this is going to sound ironic coming from somebody who wrote a book about slave traders. But in some ways, I actually think it's less important that we teach about slave traders in particular than it is that we understand the slave trade more broadly. Because I think that, look, yes, slave traders are obviously crucial players in this, right? Without them, the slave trade doesn't happen. But in terms of the kind of legacy of what they did, the legacy of what they did is not so much, people ask me all the time, they say, okay, well, where's the money now? Right? And they want to know sort of, the descendants of these slave traders, like, oh, they must be like crazy rich and they all have this money from the slave trade. Not really. I mean, there certainly are families like that, but not as much as you'd think, because the real answer to where is the money is the money's everywhere, right? The money is, because the money was always circulating, the money is all around you. All the money that was extracted, all the money that was made by extracting sort of labor and profit from enslaved people over the course of, generation and generation and generation. What became of that money? It never went back to enslaved people, right? So where did it go? Well, it went into people's pockets, and then it sort of circulated around the United States over time. So the money of the slave trade and the money of slavery it's everywhere. That's the legacy, right? The impact on enslaved people and their families and their communities. That's the legacy. And so, sure, I think it's important to know about slave traders, because I think it's important for us to remember that, look, people did this. This is what, right? Not just that it happened. People chose to make it happen. No. Right? It does, things like that don't just magically happen. People make choices to do these things, and it's important to remember that, right? But at the same time, I don't know that that's necessarily the most important thing to think about when we're thinking about the legacy of the trade.
Okay. So you mentioned the word descendants.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if this is possible, and I even talked to a few of my genealogy buddies. And because we know of the violence and the raping and things, it would just almost, if these babies lived, the descendants that could come from these men, or the men who had access, because not just them, it was also people that worked for them. And I use the example of Richard Warren from the Mayflower. They say he's got the most descendants, and it's like, how do they know that? But again, and I think of the slave trade, or just, the babies that were coming. And some of us are descendants, from this. And if besides the money, we're talking about people and generations of people. I don't even know if that could even be calculated, because there's not certain factors in place that would have stayed enough for someone to come up and say, well, Franklin, because of the slave trade, of X amount of living descendants today, or this, that, and the other. But it's almost in fact, I can't even imagine what that could be. And because throughout the book, you mentioned about, in several occasions, the repeated rapings and things like that. And yeah, you mentioned midwives. Absolutely. There were babies being born, but again, you also got this circulation. So, we'll never be able to track that, but all of us could be a result. And I'm just thinking, and just in my arena, could be a result of one of these generations coming down. So that's a hard one to even think. But then I think of Richard Warren, and they can claim there's X amount of thousands and this, that, and other, so I don't know if that's, I'm not saying that's something to be proud of, but I will say that any of us as African Americans, and if we had enslaved ancestors, we're evidence of the survival. And I'm very proud of that, and the ones that I can trace back, and others might feel the same way. But this whole buying and selling kind of disrupts kind of the normal cycle somewhat, even though it's the normal business. So I want to find out, do you think there was any evidence of resistance or agency among the enslaved people during the slave process? How did they navigate that brutal system that was actually put upon them? Were there instances that you found in the research?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think in the same way that, wherever slavery was, the slave trade was, wherever slavery was, people fought back. And that was certainly true in the slave trade. There's evidence of it scattered all over the archive. There were people who ran from slave traders. There were people who, sort of purposefully injured themselves so that they would not be valuable to a slave trader. There were people who murdered slave traders if they could. There's a reason that people are kept in chains when they're being trafficked from point A to point B, because if they're not, slave traders know somebody's going to kill me in my sleep.
Yeah.
Because they would, 1,000,000% they would, and we know that because sometimes they did. We know that people tried to bargain with slaveholders to find some way. If they heard like, okay, the slave trade is coming, we've heard a rumor, they'll do anything that they can to try to avoid being bought and sold and separated from the people that they love. So yeah, certainly resistance is absolutely everywhere. And I think it's worth noting that, I think there are scholars who argue that simply surviving is a form of resistance, right? I'm a little hesitant to go there because I think it sort of collapses everything into the category of resistance. And when you do that you sort of lose shadings of meaning there. But I think it's also critical though that we remember how powerful survival is and how powerful survival was and how challenging survival was. People, one question I get all the time is, what was the most surprising thing that you found in your research? And my answer to that is always the same. The most surprising thing when push comes to shove, when it's all done and I reflect on the whole project, the most surprising thing to me is that people survived.
Yeah.
Because I think if we tried to put ourselves in their shoes, you're taken up one day, you usually have no warning. Somebody comes out of nowhere. They take you away from your parents or your children or both, people that you love, everything you've ever known. They put you in chains and they drop you off someplace else and they work you until you die.
Right.
How long would you live? How long would you make it? I wouldn't make it. I'm quite sure I would not make it. Yeah. And some people didn't. Some people literally, they die of heartbreak.
Sure.
But most people made it because they felt like they had to. They had no choice but to survive. And to make that choice, right? I don't want to say that they actually don't have no choice. They do have a choice, right? Sure. The choice is death.
Death.
And they choose to live and to survive. And to me, that is it's a series of thousands and thousands of miracles. And I don't know that we want to put that in as resistance exactly. I think some people would, and I think that's fine. I don't think of it that way, but I think it is incredible and really hard for me to get my head around. I
agree. Can you discuss some of the primary sources that you came across during the research, and did that help you somewhat understand a little more on the subject of the trade?
Oh yeah, the project like this is impossible without primary sources, and I found stuff all over the place. Look, some of it is big chunks of stuff, right? Notarial records in New Orleans, that's a big chunk of stuff. Ship manifests, which are they're in the National Archives, but they've been digitized, right? You can find them on Ancestry, you can get them on microfilm, you can get them all kinds of places. That's a big chunk of stuff. Newspapers can be a big chunk of stuff. But sometimes
advertisement for the sales.
Exactly. But sometimes you find just sort of random things here and there, right? You find a lawsuit here, or you find, a bill of sale there, or you find, some sort of slave narrative where somebody mentions Franklin and Armfield over here. And so it's not just finding the big chunks of material, it's finding those, but also finding all the little bits and pieces that have been scattered all over the place and pulling it all together to tell the story. And I'm quite sure I didn't find everything. There's no way I found everything. There's stuff, buried in archives all over the place that could help tell more of the story than I did.
Or buried in somebody's house or the local courthouse.
Oh yeah. Another
repository.
I mean, I'll give you the one amazing story in that way that I could not have done the book without. I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. So the people ask about slave trader records, business records. Not too many of them survive. Most of them are gone for various reasons. Some purposefully destroyed, some just lost over time, whatever it is. From Franklin and Armfield, the only person whose business records survived were Rice Ballard's. And Rice Ballard's records were not available until the 90s. And the story behind this is kind of incredible. So in Natchez, Mississippi, like I said, Sam Boyd was Rice Ballard's business partner and his one of his closest friends by the end of his life. And he's the executor of Rice Ballard's will. And one day, and he lived in his mansion in Natchez until he died. And one day, at least as I've heard the story, a person shows up in the historic Natchez Foundation, which is sort of a local archive and a really good one if you ever get a chance to go down there. And they have a conversation with the director of the historic Natchez Foundation. They say, I've got this steamer trunk of stuff. They had just bought Sam Boyd's mansion. And I found this big steamer truck just full of old documents. And I think they're Sam Boyd's papers. And they bring the trunk into the historic Natchez Foundation, and it's about 5,000 items, right? So, individual letters, volumes of business ledgers, things like that. And the woman who was in charge of the historic Natchez Foundation starts looking through them, and it becomes clear to her very quickly they're not Sam Boyd's papers. They're Rice Ballard's papers that Boyd had gotten as the executor of Ballard's will. And when he was done with the will, he put them in a steamer trunk, put them up in the attic of his house, and they were sat there for 130 years. And only a few years, less than 10 years after that steamer trunk came out of that attic, that house burned down. So if that person had not found that trunk and bought them into the historic Natchez Foundation, we would not have those records at all. And I am sure that there have been fires that have destroyed records like that, but I'm equally sure that in people's basements and up in their attics somewhere, there are more treasure troves waiting to be found. And I wish we could go get them, but they get found over time.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one last question, then we'll go to the audience.
Okay.
What do you see as the next steps as far as for research in this area? Because I don't know if you're working on another book, which
I'm not working on one about the slave trade.
No. Okay. That was enough, right?
Yeah, no, it was more than enough. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any particular aspects of the slave trade that you feel need to have further exploration on? As far as from where you left off, and we already said there's more out there, but what do you see that would be next steps needed?
So I think there are a couple of places I can think of off the top of my head. One is I think we could use a lot more on those kind of local exchanges that you're talking about, whether it's slave trades within a particular city, or within counties or within, particular regions that are sort of smaller scale than what I was looking at. But I think the biggest thing I can think of in that regard, at least from the perspective of the trade as opposed to enslaved people, right, is that, Franklin and Armfield, like a lot of very big interstate traders, moved people by ship. Right. Because there were reasons for that, which, sure, I can get into if somebody else really wants to know about it. But that was a choice that they made, was to move people by ship. The vast majority of the slave trade, though, did not operate by ship. The vast majority of the slave trade moved by people being forcibly walked from point A to point B. And Franklin and Armfield did some of that. And I talk about that in the book. Yeah. But, in terms of the proportion of the trade, I mean, I don't know what that percentage would be, but it's got to be at least 80-90% of the trade is people just being walked one place to the next. And we really we don't have any systematic sense of what that looked like, how it worked, what was the scale of it. And honestly, I don't know if it's possible because the records aren't there. But I would love to see somebody just accumulate everything that has survived about that, about the overland trade, and just tell us that story. What is that story? We have some of it from the perspective of enslaved people. We have people who've worked on that from slave narratives and kind of pieced that part of it together. But from the operational side of things, we really know a lot less about that than you would think we would. And that would be an amazing project for somebody to take on, somebody who's not me.
And I know of one that did that. Brigadier General John Harthwell Cox sent 40 people from Fluvanna, Virginia to Hopewell, believe it was Hopewell, Alabama, to another plantation. They walked.
Yep.
And those descendants there in Alabama know their roots came from Virginia. And they know Bremo Plantation was it. So again, and that's been looked at, and there's some stuff out there. But again, that's only one, thinking about that. So I am going to check in the chat and give you some questions, and then I give you the last chance if you want to ask the audience any questions or anything like that, or what would be your one takeaway you would like folks to take away, regarding your book or this research or something. So that's how we'll end this up. So one question from Rosalind Miller out in Arizona. She's on page 2.
Okay, we're getting very specific. Okay.
Here. She said, the way we send out dead Negroes at night and keep dark is a sin to Crockett. And her question is, please explain the meaning of this reference to Crockett.
Yeah, no, that's a weird one. And it took me a bit of digging around on the internet and searching through sort of old slang, kind of not necessarily dictionaries, but sort of lexicons of old slang to figure that one out. So the reference is to Davy Crockett, right? Okay. Who was at the time, he was a congressman by then, actually, but was known as this sort of like, kind of wild man, adventurer sort of thing. He was kind of this sort of legendary character. And the expression of a sin to Crockett was something that was, so sort of wild and over the top and crazy that even Davy Crockett would have been like, whoa, that's a bit strong for me. Right. So and so basically it was a joke. Yeah. Right. I mean, which makes the expression even more disturbing in that context. Right. Because the context is Isaac Franklin, burying cholera victims at night. I mean, he's not even burying them. He's really just dumping them in a ravine. Right. And he's making a joke to his business partner. He's like, the way that we take these people out and kind of dump them in the dark of night is a sin to Crockett. Right, which they would have thought was very funny. Like, yeah, it's pretty crazy. You're right. So that's what that expression means.
Okay, and Viola Baskerville's making a comment. She said, "I'm also reading the 1938 book by W. Stevenson, Isaac Franklin, Slave Trader and Planter, which has a list of enslaved persons conveyed and inventoried by Isaac Franklin." So that's another place, another resource for folks. And so thank you for that.
Yeah. So that I will say though, that is not, so that's to the extent that there's ever another biography of Franklin, that's it. The lists of people in that book though they're not people who were bought and sold by Franklin in the slave trade. Those lists, that's an inventory. Those are inventories from Franklin's estate after he died. So after he retired from the slave trade, he becomes a plantation owner. When he dies, he is the enslaver of about 600 or 700 people. And so, of course, like any estate sale, you have to sort of take an inventory of the estate. So that's what those lists of names are, and they're hugely valuable, right? Having lists of enslaved people's names is always valuable, but it's not that the book is actually not really about his. It has some stuff about his career as a slave trader, but it's as much about his career and his life after the trade, because that's where the records were in 1938. Sure. That's what you could find.
Okay. Bernice Bennett says, did you find any parishes in Louisiana where the number of enslaved individuals were sent?
Yeah. So when you look at, so there are a couple of ways to do that, right? So Franklin and Armfield, their biggest places of business in the lower South were in New Orleans and in Natchez, right? Mm-hmm. So in Natchez, it's right across the Mississippi River from Louisiana, right? It's right across from, I can't remember what parish it is, but I think it's Vidalia, but I can't remember the name. It might be Vidalia Parish. I can't remember. And so if you go into the courthouse in those parishes, kind of right along the river across from Natchez, you can look in those notarial records and look for the names Franklin, Armfield, Ballard, and see who they sold people to. Now in New Orleans, this is a place that was a huge market for enslaved people. So in the notarial records, you will find who the seller is, who the enslaved person is, and who the buyer was. And the buyer is sometimes from New Orleans, often from New Orleans. But I was able actually to trace kind of the sort of diaspora of people being sold. And they're sold, many of them are parishes sort of immediately around New Orleans, but some of them are parishes, Tensas Parish, which is 200 miles away. So you can see people in different parishes who are bought and sold by Franklin, for sure.
And let me see. Michelle says, are records of over-the-land slave travel trade easier or harder to find than the slave trade via the boats in the boat manifest? And I think you commented a little bit.
Yeah, much harder. The short answer is much harder.
Yes, very much. Let me see. I'm looking for, there's a lot of questions.
That's good.
So Shelby Cohen is saying the slave trade out of Maryland was ridiculous. The cover up in Maryland is real. Work steps from where the slave pens were in Baltimore, and then no idea where they could have went from there. So, and of course, a lot of folks are tapping into DNA now, but I don't know how that all fits in, coming back to what I said earlier. And so, but researchers are finding that, and I'm going to say, and it works both ways for whites and blacks. You're finding the connections, DNA connections. And I'm not looking personally for Franklin or Ballard. I have enough. I don't have these other guys included. So was there absolute agency among the enslaved during the domestic slave trade? And this is from Nicole Green.
I suppose that depends what you mean by absolute agency, right? Enslaved people, particularly enslaved people, while they are being trafficked in the trade, they're prisoners, right? They're human trafficking victims. So do they have agency? Sure. They're not, they're human beings, right? They're not literally cargo, even they're sort of being treated and thought of as cargo. So to the extent that people can have agency in a situation like that, yes, of course, because they're human beings like any other human beings. But do they have really the kind of capacity to, the absolute capacity to completely sort of alter their circumstances? No, they don't. It's in most cases not possible. But that's not to say that they don't try and that they don't, that they don't want to.
During your research in writing this book, did any of the descendants of those traders ever contact you, even during or after, about their ancestors?
So that's a great question, and I love telling that I love talking about this. Actually, no, I really do. So, all right. So just to give you a sense of what we mean when we're talking about descendants, right? So Isaac Franklin had 4 white children that we know of.
Mm-hmm.
None of them lived to adulthood.
Right.
But he was also one of 10. So he had a lot of brothers and sisters and a lot of nieces and nephews. So there are a lot of people with connections to Franklin in some way or another. John Armfield, he and his wife had no children. None that survived anyway. There's a rumor that they had babies who died, but there are no living children, white children. However, he and his wife did raise some of his. Now, his wife, by the way, was one of Isaac Franklin's nieces.
Right.
And they raised some of her nephews and nieces. So Franklin's like great, I guess it would have been great nephews and nieces. They raised them as kind of their own children. And so they're descendants of people who are effectively descendants of John Armfield, although not genetic descendants. Mm-hmm. Rice Ballard had 3 daughters, all of whom, to the best of my knowledge, lived to adulthood, some of whom had families of their own. So that's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. I was in the archives in Nashville one day. And as you often do with a project like this, you Google, right? Yeah. And I came across a Facebook group of people who were descendants of Isaac Franklin's father. Right? Isaac Franklin's father was one of these sort of Tennessee pioneers. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. One of these sort of very early Tennessee settlers. So he had, this Facebook page about his descendants. And I'm not sure what prompted me to do this, but I Facebook messaged the I don't know what it is. I guess the moderator of the group.
Yeah.
And she emailed me back, and we had lunch, and I have since met many. I wouldn't say most, because I'm sure there are hundreds of them, but many descendants of Franklin and Armfield, right? So not direct descendants, but descendants in some way or another. And that has been kind of amazing, actually. I haven't talked to them in a couple of years, but in the lead up to the book, I talked to them a lot, and I definitely talked to them after the book came out. And it gets back to the question of, is this what white people are afraid of? These are white people who are not afraid of this story. Some of them didn't know the story growing up, but they came to it as adults, and they wanted to know more. And many of them feel a real sense of, I think guilt is the wrong word, but they feel a real sense of responsibility that they in some ways are kind of the living legacy of these men. And that's a hard thing to get your head around. So I have been in contact with them. Now the Rice Ballard part of this is the funniest part. And I mean, funny, like, I'm not sure what to do about it, because there have to be people alive today who are direct genetic descendants of Rice Ballard, unless something terrible happened in that family. There are people today who would be his probably great grandchildren. Right. Maybe even great grandchildren, depending how old people were. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I could find them. I'm sure I could, right? Sure. If you really wanted to, if you wanted to do the work, you could find them.
We can find them.
And I've never done it because I sort of feel like if they're people who are like the descendants I've met, then I don't need to tell them that. No. Right? They're going to reckon with that story in their own way. And I would love if somehow somebody gave them the book and they contacted me, because I would love to know their story.
Sure.
But if they don't want to know, right? If they're those people who are afraid, uncomfortable, hostile. I'm not going to be the guy who makes that phone call, sends that email, shows up on their door and say, hey, did you know about your great great grandfather?
Right.
He was nasty. He was a slave trader. He's one of
Yeah.
the worst people you can possibly imagine having lived.
Right.
I don't want to be that person. Why would I do that? Right? What would be the point of that? So that's the long version of that story. And it's honestly knowing that people who are personally invested in this story have read the book and found it meaningful to them in some way or another has been hugely gratifying for me.
And it's interesting because Charlottesville Oggs chapter had celebrated this several years ago, celebrated their 10th anniversary as a society. And the keynote speaker was the third great grandson of Nat Turner.
Wow.
And so the interview and the discussion revolved around, which I would say to Franklin's descendants, whoever, what did you hear? Did you know, and things like that? And does that legacy keep going in the family? Recognize especially the impact to America, because this had impact all over the place, with the buying and selling and everything. So another question is there a sense of the figures gained from the lucrative domestic slave trade and its lasting impact on American economy today?
I don't think there's really a good way to reckon that specifically, right? If you're looking for a dollar amount, I think there are probably ways to estimate it and kind of do some guesswork and kind of, probably even better than sort of back of the envelope, doing some basic arithmetic. But I think it's going to be really difficult to figure out kind of the in any sort of really specific or reliable way what that figure is. It's a lot. Let's say that.
Okay, I'm going to give you one more and then I'll let you respond to my final question.
Okay.
I found this is from Alvin Blake's. I found an online 1832 bill of sale for an 18-year-old woman named Kitty Sewell, born about 1814, sold by Isaac Franklin of Natchez to J.C. Patrick in Wilkinson County, Mississippi.
Okay.
What would be the recommended steps to find how she came into his possession? And he says, I have not found her in Patrick's estate records.
So, I mean, I guess the question is sort of
Franklin.
Well, it's tricky, right? I mean, the possession of either one of them, right? The short answer I can tell you, right? But the longer answer is how you're going to find it exactly. Right. That is harder, right? So the short answer is that the odds are that that Patrick came to Natchez one day and went to Isaac Franklin's showroom and purchased her out of the lot. I mean, that's the short answer, right? And Franklin wrote him up a bill of sale. And because, sales in places like Mississippi were private sales, right? So it's a private bill of sale, and Patrick kept it in his records, and that's it. How she get to Natchez? Probably she is shipped from Virginia. If it's 1832, you said? Yes. That was the bill of sale. Yeah, I mean, she may or may not appear on a ship manifest. I'm actually sort of trying to call up my manifest as we speak, because I can, I have everything. Of Natchez to Wilkinson County, Mississippi. Right, but she has to get to Natchez from somewhere, and the odds are that she's coming from Virginia or Maryland, right? I mean, that's the answer. Now, who is she? How does Franklin come into possession of her? Very unlikely you're going to be able to figure that out, right? Who sells her to Armfield and Franklin in Virginia? We don't know.
And then they're about that scale of the small.
Right. She may be on a ship manifest. If it's 1832, I think I found, I was able to trace sort of every shipment that they made. I was able to figure that out. And I think I ended up finding manifests for about 80% of them. Okay. So, if her, and I really want to find it.
And no, wait, got a last name too. And I'm
right. Exactly. And the names are usually there. Hold on. I'm going to open this up real quick. What was the last name?
You're fine.
What was the last name?
Sewell. You're talking
Spell
about
it for me.
Person. Kitty Sewell.
How you spell the last name?
E-L-L. S as in Sam.
I don't have a Kitty Sewell. I have a Boswell Sewell, a Charles Sewell, and a Frank Sewell, and a David Sewell. Now it's possible her name was spelled differently in the notarial records, or in the ship manifests. There are certainly plenty of Kitties who are sold without a last name. I mean, I'm looking at right now.
They would put her birth about 1814.
Yeah, I mean, I have 1814. So in 1832, she's 18 years old. Let's see. I mean, I see 18 Kitties in here. So, oh, wait. Hold on. I think I might have found her. On a ship manifest. Yeah. 18 on the Brig Tribune from Alexandria, March 14th, 1832, out of Alexandria, shipped by Franklin and Armfield. There is a woman on the manifest. And I can't tell if it doesn't say her last name or if I couldn't read it, but it's Kitty S. She's 18 years old, 4 foot and 11 and a half inches tall. That may be her. Now, and so if that manifest is available on Ancestry, so you can go look that up. It's the Brig Tribune, March 1832, and you can find her. Now, how she got to Alexandria, that I don't think we're gonna know. But so there you go. That's if you emailed me and said, what can you tell me about this person? That's the most I'd be able to tell you.
Right. And again, go to Ancestry and also watch the episode we had last month and with Dr. Jenny Williams from
Jenny's great.
And her whole time was on the database Kinfolkology, and which is the domestic slave trade. And of course, there's oceans of kinfolk from slave voyages, but she has the ship manifest. And maybe there's something also there, at least to get used to looking at these manifests and things.
Yeah, the core of Jenny's project is her dissertation, which was about Baltimore specifically, but she's gotten broader than that. And so I think she's trying to get all the manifests, kind of the information extracted and all of them put online.
Yes. And again, very informative. So I'm going to throw something to you in our last couple minutes. If you want to, one takeaway you want people, to walk away from here and, not necessarily just go buy the book or type thing, because we've got the book.
Yeah. Well, definitely go buy the book and tell all of your friends to buy multiple copies of the book. Right. Every author says that.
Yes. So is there one thing you want to make sure about the book and the research and stuff that you have done that you would like people to take away with? It could even be a further step or something. And I will say this, a lot of us are looking for our people.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of my inclination is to say something like that, right? Which is to say, if you are, because I know, like you said, a lot of people on this call or on this podcast are descendants, genealogists, maybe both. I'm not going to lie and tell you that this will be easy. all I would say is there are a lot of pieces of people's stories that are out there, and you may run into a lot of roadblocks and a lot of dead ends. If you have it in you, don't give up. Keep looking, keep asking questions. Even if you don't find the answers that you're looking for, it's like doing any kind of historical research. You can't always find the answer to the question that you're looking for, but you may find answers that are very compelling, powerful, interesting, in other ways. And you may be able to recover other people's stories that would never be recovered if you didn't find them. So, be stubborn and be persistent.
And do like Yoda says, do not try.
Right.
You have to go out there. So I appreciate your time and thank you immensely. And thank the audience for coming. I do want to make a point that October 19th is our next Saturday webinar, and we'll have the folks from 10 Million Names Project will be on. And so hopefully you'll find that interesting to find out more information about that project. And so to you, Josh, I'm going to say thank you for the book. I'm not going to say the pleasures of reading it.
No, nobody ever says I really enjoyed the book. Yeah.
Right. But it gives great knowledge for us that are researching, and it is going to take time. And so appreciate your time. Hope to see folks next month, and have a good Saturday, everybody.
Yes, you too. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the questions. And I hope this was valuable.
I believe it was very valuable.
Okay, good.
And so I'm going to throw it back to Darius to clue us out. Thank you again.
Thank you.